The storm crawled over the Badlands with the slow, angry rumble of something ancient waking from restless sleep, lightning tearing open the sky and flashing. Against the lonely silhouette of Mason Holt, the cowboy who had long since stopped, believing the world had anything left to give him. His hat brim dripped with rain, his horse's mane whipped in the wind, and he kept riding not because he had somewhere to go, but because stopping meant remembering. The wind carried ghosts, his family's laughter, the crackle of the fire that destroyed the Holt ranch, the screams he could not save, and he held his silence like armor. But on that storm-torn ridge, something broke the rhythm of the rain. A shape. No, a body. Mason slowed instinctively, senses sharpening the way they did around rattlers. When he slid off his horse, boots sinking into mud, he saw her, young, soaked to the bone, covered in dirt and bruises, curled on her side, as if trying to hide from the sky itself. She tried to crawl away when his shadow fell over her, but she had no strength left. Her voice came out like cracked glass. "If you're here to finish it, just kill me fast." Mason froze, stunned not by the words, but the raw terror shaking behind them. Her eyes were wide, wild, swollen with pain that wasn't from the storm. Lightning lit her face, revealing the deep exhaustion of someone who had run far, fought hard, and still expected only cruelty. Mason knelt slowly, holding his hands out so she could see he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, though she recoiled anyway, trembling like a cornered fawn. Rain splattered across his back as he took off his coat and draped it gently over her shoulders. Despite her whispering, "Don't! Please don't," he lifted her carefully, feeling how light she was, as if the world had already stripped her down to fear and bone. She didn't fight, she simply went limp, too far gone to resist or trust. Mason looked out at the endless storm and made a decision without thinking, guided by something deeper than reason, something that stirred with old pain and new purpose. Whoever had hurt this woman had left her for the elements to finish. But Mason Holt had buried enough innocent people. Not tonight, not her. He carried her through the rain toward the forgotten shepherd's cabin hidden in the pines, unaware yet that saving her would drag him into a darkness even the storm feared. Mason pushed open the door of the abandoned shepherd's cabin with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the unconscious woman in his arms. The hinges groaned in protest, as if resenting being disturbed after years of silence. But the cabin was still standing, a small miracle in a land where storm swallowed buildings like bone-dry tinder. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped from ceiling beams, but it was shelter, and right now that was all she needed. Mason laid her gently on the old cot by the wall, brushing aside debris, with his hat before lowering her onto it. Her breathing was shallow, trembling, as if each inhale cost her another memory she couldn't afford to lose. Her wet dress clung to her thin frame, revealing bruises blooming like dark violets along her arms and ribs. Mason turned away for a moment to light the fire, striking flint with practiced motions until sparks caught the dry kindling he always kept in his saddlebag. Warmth slowly filled the room, shadows retreating to the corners. When he approached her again, she flinched even in her semi-conscious state, curling away from him as if touch itself had betrayed her too many times. He knelt slowly. "You're safe," he said, voice low, steady, the way he used to talk to frightened foals. Her eyelids fluttered. "Safe," she whispered, as if tasting a word she hadn't spoken in years. "No one is safe from them." The last word broke, splintering into fear so deep Mason felt it settle in the air like gunpowder. He gave her water, lifting her gently enough that she wouldn't panic. She drank like someone who hadn't tasted clean water for days. When she finally met his eyes, he saw a mixture of suspicion, exhaustion, and a thin flicker of hope she was too afraid to acknowledge. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She hesitated long enough for him to think she wouldn't answer. Then so softly it almost disappeared under the crackling fire. She said, "Elara," Mason nodded, repeating it to anchor it in his mind. Names mattered. Names meant someone existed beyond their suffering. Elara looked away quickly, hugging her knees under the blanket, eyes darting to every shadow as if expecting monsters to claw their way through the walls. "They'll come for me," she whispered. "They always come." Mason didn't know who they were yet, but he already hated them with a cold, growing certainty. He sat by the fire, keeping watch, letting her see he wasn't trying to touch her or claim anything. Outside, the storm softened, but inside the cabin, fear still howled through her bones. Mason didn't sleep. He kept guard all night, because even though she didn't trust him yet, he had already decided something unshakable. No one was taking Alara back. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean but heavy with the scent of wet pine and danger. Inside the cabin, however, the air was thick with something far more fragile, Alara's fear. She tried to sit up, wincing sharply as pain stabbed through her side. Mason stepped forward instinctively, then stopped himself mid-motion, palms raised to show he respected her space. "You're hurt bad," he said gently. "I need to check your injuries, or you won't make it through the day." Her fingers dug into the blanket, knuckles white, eyes wide with the instinctive terror of someone who had been handled roughly too many times. For a long heartbeat, she didn't speak, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Then she nodded, barely, shakily giving consent because survival demanded it, not trust. Mason moved slowly, like approaching a wounded mare, and knelt beside the cot. "I'm just checking for broken bones and open wounds," he murmured, narrating each motion so she wouldn't panic. When he gently lifted the torn hem of her dress to see where she was hurt, he expected bruises, maybe cuts. What he didn't expect was the brand. His breath stopped, burned into her skin, fresh enough to still be angry red around the edges. Was a twisted symbol shaped like a curved thorn, a mark so cruel, so deliberate, so savage it turned his stomach. Alara's voice was barely audible. "They said it would remind me who I belong to." She swallowed hard, tears spilling silently. "But I don't belong to anyone." Mason lowered the cloth slowly, reverently, as if covering a terrible truth he wished he could erase. Fury rose in him like wildfire, hot and choking, but he forced it down because she didn't need his anger. She needed steadiness. "You don't belong to them," he said with a certainty that shook even himself. "You're not property. Not now. Not ever." Alara stared at him with disbelief, as if she wanted to believe him but had forgotten how. Mason cleaned the area with careful hands, swearing silently that whoever had done this would answer for it. The brand wasn't just a wound, it was a message, a possession mark used by outlaw clans who believed cruelty was loyalty. But to Mason, it was something else, a declaration of war. Alara pulled the blanket around herself again, shaking uncontrollably. "They'll find me," she whispered. "They always do." Mason met her terrified gaze with steel. "Let them try." Throughout the long afternoon, Mason tended to Alara's wounds with a gentleness she clearly did not expect from a man built like a weathered oak post. He boiled water, cleaned cuts, wrapped bandages, and offered her food she barely touched. Every time he came close, her shoulders tightened, breath hitching, as if she was bracing for the cruelty she had learned to expect. From every man she'd met since being taken, Mason didn't push, didn't rush her, didn't ask questions, except those necessary for tending her injuries. When she muttered apologies for flinching or slowing him down, he only shook his head. "You've got nothing to apologize for," he said, voice steady enough to anchor a sinking ship. As the hours passed, Alara began to murmur fragments of her story, not because she trusted him yet, but because silence felt heavier than truth. She spoke of a group called the Thorned Circle, a roaming outlaw clan, known in whispers for branding anyone they claimed as theirs. They'd taken her off a wagon trail at dusk, brought her to a camp deep in the timberline, and punished her whenever she resisted their rules. She had escaped only because they grew overconfident and drunk, leaving one guard asleep. She fled barefoot into the dark, the brand still burning on her skin. Udbun ran until her legs gave out on the ridge. Mason listened with a clenched jaw, his eyes narrowing with every word. He'd heard of the Thorned Circle before, stories around fires, tales of families who vanished, ranches beaten, travelers marked and broken. But hearing it from someone who had lived it changed the stories from rumor to reality. When Ilara caught him staring at the door, she whispered, "You should let me go. If they find me here, they'll kill you too." Mason shook his head slowly. "I've lived through worse," he said, though the pain in his eyes hinted at ghosts he didn't speak of. The fire crackled softly between them, the only witness to two souls trying to believe the world still held goodness. Ilara finally looked at him, not the fearful sideways glance from before, but a direct look, fragile and searching. "Why are you helping me?" Mason paused, his answer simple but heavy. "Because someone should have helped my family when evil came for us. Nobody did. I won't let that happen again." The words hung in the air, warm and painful both. Ilara lowered her gaze, but her breathing eased, even if only slightly. For the first time since he found her, the terror in her eyes flickered, and underneath it, something else began to glow faintly, the first fragile spark of trust. Mason didn't sleep that night, not even when the fire burned low and the desert finally fell quiet. Ilara lay on the cot inside the small, abandoned way station they'd taken refuge in, her breathing soft but uneven, her mind fighting through memories she wasn't ready to speak of. Mason sat outside the doorway, rifle across his lap, boots planted firm in the dirt, eyes fixed on every shadow that dared move. He'd fought men before, but something about the Rough Riders, their cruelty, their numbers, their hunger for control, made this different. As the first hints of dawn crawled over the horizon, Ilara stirred, her voice fragile as she whispered his name. Mason stepped inside, hat in hand, trying not to look too worried. But she saw right through him. She always did. "You saw the brand," she said quietly, touching her thigh with a wince. "You know what they wanted me for." Mason clenched his jaw. The memory of that burned symbol made his blood heat like wildfire. "I know what they did," he corrected, kneeling beside her. "But you ain't property. You ain't theirs, and you ain't alone anymore." Ilara swallowed hard, tears trembling at the edge of her lashes. "They took me from my family, from everything I knew. They said any woman marked with their brand belonged to them until they were done. They said no one would ever help me, that nobody had the courage to go against them." Mason gently lifted her chin, forcing her eyes to meet his. "Then they were dead wrong." She trembled, not from fear this time, but from the first spark of hope she'd felt in months. "Mason, if they find us—" He put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "If they find us, they'll wish they hadn't." For the first time she believed him. She told him everything, how the riders raided her town, how she fought back, how they branded her for defiance, and how she escaped when a storm scared off their horses. By the time she finished, Mason felt something in him shift, a purpose he hadn't felt since before his brother died. This wasn't just rescue anymore. This was war. Ilara reached for his hand, her fingers trembling against his rough calluses. "Why risk your life for me?" Mason's voice dropped low. "Because no one else ever did when I needed saving. And because no woman deserves a fate carved into her skin." She let out a soft, broken breath, and Mason realized that protecting her wasn't a choice anymore. It was a vow he'd take to his grave when the sun finally rose high enough to burn away the chill of dawn. Mason packed only what they needed: water, ammunition, and a stubborn resolve that felt heavier than any saddlebag. Ilara watched him quietly as he saddled the mare, her steps unsteady but improving, her eyes still shadowed, yet burning with determination. "We're going to them, aren't we?" she asked. Mason didn't bother softening the truth. "Ain't no choice. They'll come for you, and I'd rather meet devils on ground I choose." She nodded, tightening her borrowed coat around her. She was afraid. Any fool could see that, but she didn't let it stop her from climbing onto the horse behind him, her arms slipping around his waist for balance. The touch made Mason's heartbeat thump once, harder than expected, but he kept his eyes fixed ahead. This wasn't the time for softness. They rode hard through the desert, the wind whipping her hair across his back, her breath warm against him. Hours later, they reached the canyon the riders used as a hideout, a place Mason had avoided for years, ever since rumors spread about bodies disappearing into its cliffs. Smoke curled from campfires below, and Mason counted at least 14 horses tied by the rope line. Ilara tensed behind him. She recognized those brands. "We can't fight all of them," she whispered. Mason's eyes narrowed. "Don't need to. Just need to cut off the head of the snake." He explained the plan, silent, quick and brutal, striking their leader before the others knew what happened. But plans were like sand, always slipping, always changing. Before they even reached the canyon floor, a rider spotted them and shouted. Gunfire cracked the air. Mason grabbed Ilara and leapt from the horse, rolling behind a boulder as bullets shattered stone around them. "Stay down!" Mason ordered, firing back with deadly precision, dropping one outlaw with a single shot. Dust clouded the air. Horses screamed. Men cursed and scrambled for cover. Mason pushed Ilara deeper between rocks. "If anything happens to me, don't you dare finish that," she snapped, gripping his arm. "I'm not losing you." Her voice shook, but her eyes were fierce. Mason had never seen anything braver. He brushed his thumb across her cheek, a fleeting touch before he surged up and returned fire. The canyon erupted in chaos. The riders were closing in fast. And Mason Holt, the lonely cowboy who once sought nothing but silence, now fought like a man with something worth dying. For the fight dragged into hours that felt like days. The canyon echoing with gunfire, ricochets, and the sharp cries of men who realized too late that Mason Holt wasn't alone anymore. Ilara, crouched behind the rocks, watched as Mason moved with terrifying precision, each shot deliberate, each step fueled by something deeper than vengeance. He wasn't killing for sport, he was protecting her, and every time a rider fell, she felt a strange mix of guilt, relief, and awe. But the riders had numbers, and numbers always wore a man down. Mason took a hit to the shoulder, stumbling as the impact spun him sideways. Ilara gasped and rushed from cover despite his shouts. She grabbed him before he collapsed, her hands slick with blood, her breath shaking. "Stay with me, Mason," she whispered fiercely. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright because seeing her cry hurt more than the bullet. "Ain't going nowhere," he rasped. The rider leader, Cade Riker, a monster of a man with a cruel grin, finally emerged from the dust, dragging a chain behind him like a trophy. "That girl's ours," he spat, pointing at Ilara. "Brand says so. You're interfering with rider business." "Cowboy!" Mason stepped in front of her, wiping blood from his jaw. "Brand don't mean a damn thing," he growled. "And neither do you," Riker laughed, a deep, sick sound. "She begged when we took her." "She'll beg again." Mason's vision went red. Ilara grabbed his hand, grounding him with her touch. "Mason," she whispered, her voice breaking. "End him." Those two words were all he needed. Mason charged, tackling Riker as both men crashed into the dust, fists flying, blood splattering the sand. The world narrowed into the sound of bones cracking and the raw fury of a man pushed beyond every limit. Riker fought dirty, knives hidden, sand thrown. Every move meant to maim, but Mason refused to fall. Every blow he landed was for Ilara. Every breath he took was for the vow he made. Finally, with a brutal swing, Mason drove Riker's head into the canyon floor, ending the fight with a sickening thud. The remaining riders, seeing their leader dead, scattered like cowards. Silence fell at last, heavy, trembling, almost unreal. Mason collapsed to his knees, breath ragged. Ilara rushed to him, cradling his face as tears streaked down her dirt-smudged cheeks. "You came for me," she whispered. Mason managed a broken smile. "I'd ride through hell again if that's where you were." And for the first time, she believed she was truly free. The sun was dipping low by the time they left. The canyon behind, each step slow but sure, the desert wind carrying. Away the last traces of smoke and blood. Mason rode with Ilara in his arms, his shoulder wrapped in torn cloth, his strength nearly spent, but his spirit strangely lighter than he'd felt in years. They reached an old abandoned ranch house Mason once used as a hideout. Its wooden beams were cracked, its roof patchy, but it was quiet, safe, and far from the reach of any outlaw. Ilara helped him inside, refusing to let him pretend he wasn't hurting. She cleaned his wound with gentle hands, her touch soft but determined, her eyes lingering on him with an affection that grew stronger each time he winced and tried to hide it. "You saved my life," she murmured as she tied the bandage. "More than once." Mason caught her wrist before she pulled away. "You saved mine too. Ilara gave me something worth fighting for again." She swallowed hard, her breath trembling as emotions she'd buried for so long finally pushed to the surface. "I thought the brand they gave me meant I'd be marked forever," she whispered. "That no one would ever see me as anything but what they tried to turn me into." Mason gently brushed his thumb across her cheek, his touch slow and reverent. "You ain't theirs. You ain't broken. And that mark don't define you, not to me, not ever." Tears slipped down her face, not of fear, but of release, of finally believing she wasn't doomed to her past. She leaned into him, their foreheads touching. The silence filled with meaning, neither needed to speak aloud. Later, as the desert sky blazed with stars, Ilara stepped outside, the wind lifting her hair as she stared at the vastness ahead. Mason joined her, his arm brushing hers. "What now?" she asked softly. Mason took a long breath. "Whatever life you want. If you want to leave, I'll take you wherever you choose. If you want to stay, well, I wouldn't mind that either." She turned to him, heart pounding. "I don't want to run anymore." Her hand found his, fingers interlacing with a certainty she'd never felt before. "I want a life I choose. And I choose you, Mason." His chest tightened, warmth blooming deeper than any sunset. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that erased every cruel touch she'd ever endured. She rested her head against him, listening to the steady rhythm of a man who'd fought the world to give her back her name, her dignity, her future. And though the brand on her skin would fade slowly, the new one she carried, the one shaped by courage, freedom, and the love of a lonely cowboy, was the only mark that mattered now.